So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm James Shaheen, Tricycle's editor-in-chief. We're thrilled to have Donald S. Lopez Jr. with us today for a discussion on Buddhism's 4 big unanswered questions, which we'll get to in a moment. Today's Zoom session will be recorded for anyone who is unable to attend live, and we'll make it available on Tricycle's YouTube channel. The link is posted in the chat in case you want to share it with friends who can't be here, or if you want to watch it again. We are providing this event for free, so if you haven't already and would like to support Tricycle, please consider giving a donation link in the chat. So today's guest, Donald S. Lopez Jr. is Arthur E. Link Distinguished University Professor of Buddhist and Tibetan Studies in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures at the University of Michigan. You can see why we wrote that down. He specializes in Mahayana Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism, and has written extensively on encounters between Buddhism and the West. He was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2000. He is currently working on a global history of Buddhism with Yale University Press. We're also lucky to call Don a Tricycle contributing editor. I should say he was at Tricycle before I was. And I have to break script for a second because I have sitting next to me the Princeton Dictionary of Buddhism, which we rely on heavily, so we make plenty of mistakes otherwise. So just wanting to know you are going to be listening to the guy who literally wrote the Buddhist dictionary with Robert Buswell, of course. So here's a little bit of a backstory. Don was kind enough to give a talk to the Tricycle staff some time ago. And afterwards, one of us asked him what topics he found pressing in Buddhist studies. And he answered with 4 in the form of questions. And they are: 1, when did the Buddha die? 2, where did Mahayana Buddhism come from? 3, where did Tantra first develop, or what is Buddhismtantra? And 4, why did Buddhism disappear on the subcontinent? Okay, so the way this will work is that Don will speak to each of these questions for 10 minutes, and then he will take 5 minutes after each question to answer your questions. So please ask your questions in the Q&A tab below as Don speaks. So please type away. So welcome, Don. Thank you for joining us.
Nice to be here. Thanks, James. So as James mentioned, I did raise these questions with the Tricycle staff some time ago, and I was not intending to have to actually answer them. And so I wanted to just begin with a disclaimer that I will not be able to provide a definitive answer to any of these questions. But I want to talk about the importance of raising the questions and actually the terms in which they should be stated. So when we look at the history of Buddhism, we have to say, well, of course, the life of the Buddha is one of the most important things that happened. Secondly, we have the rise of the Mahayana, whatever that was. Third, we have the rise of Tantra, and then we have Buddhism disappearing. So when we look at Indian Buddhism, these are 4 major questions that scholars have been struggling with literally for almost 200 years. So let's begin with the big one. When did the Buddha live? So I went and looked at some Buddhist sources. And so in Chinese works, one of the most widely accepted dates for the death of the Buddha. And it's important to say that we date Buddhism from the Buddha's death, the passage into nirvana, not his birth, which is, I think, quite interesting. So the Chinese give the date of 949 BCE. The Kalachakra Tantra gives the date as 876 BCE. The Theravada tradition gives the date as 544 BCE. Various Tibetan sources give dates as early as 2420 BCE. And contemporary scholars continue to argue for dates ranging from 544 to 368 BCE. So that's really talking about a 118-year gap among modern scholars. And when we look at scholars of Christianity, they are really trying to get the birth of Jesus down to within about a year, probably, let's say, 4 BCE. So we have this giant range of time from which we're trying to figure out when did the Buddha live. And of course, setting the date and time has huge implications about what Buddhism actually was in the beginning. So the answer is that we really don't know. And we have nothing written down, of course, that the Buddha taught probably for 3 or 400 years after his death, if we knew when he died. Again, when we look at Christianity, we have Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians, probably about 50 CE. If Jesus was crucified in 30 CE, that's a 20-year gap. So we're looking at a huge period of time in the case of Buddhism. So here, we always want to then turn to Ashoka. Ashoka is the great Buddhist king, the emperor of the Mauryan dynasty. He was probably crowned in about 269 BCE. And we have in Ashoka's rock edicts the first mention of the Buddha. So this is the first example we have of Indian writing, and there we find Buddhism mentioned, the Buddha mentioned, some Buddhist texts mentioned. And we know that by the time of Ashoka, again, crowned in about 269, we have rock edicts at the place where the Buddha was born, where he was enlightened, where he gave his first sermon, where he passed into nirvana. So by the time of Ashoka, we know that Buddhism was well established. The pilgrimage places were well established. And quite fascinatingly, we have in one of his edicts the statement that he has restored the stupa of Kanakamuni. Kanakamuni is one of the earlier Buddhas. So we know that by the time of Ashoka, the cult of the previous Buddhas was in place, and there was a stupa that Ashoka felt needed to be restored by that time. So we're looking then at Ashoka as really the mark in history where we can start talking about the Buddha and Buddhism more precisely. So we have two different Indian sources on when Ashoka ruled. So we have the very famous legend of Ashoka, the Ashoka Avadana in Sanskrit, which says that Ashoka was crowned 100 years after the death of the Buddha. Then we have the famous Pali text, the Mahavamsa, which says that Ashoka was crowned 218 years after the death of the Buddha. So that's a gap of 118 years. And when we look back at history that long ago, sometimes we may think, well, 118 years, that's not that important. It's not that long. But I think that's really a presentist attitude that we have. It'd be like saying, did the American Civil War begin in 1861 or 1979? I mean, it's a huge difference. So essentially, we are left with this question of when the Buddha died. This is the most important date in Buddhism because, of course, we have all of these prophecies saying such and such will happen this many years after the death of the Buddha. For example, we have a prophecy that Nagarjuna will appear 400 years after the death of the Buddha. And so this date just remains unknown to us, very difficult to determine. And of course, it raises the very problematical question, which is, can we say with certainty that the Buddha was a historical figure at all? This is a question that comes up in Buddhist studies about every 20 years. It's come up again recently. So Bernard Faure at Columbia University has written a book in French called The 1001 Lives of the Buddha, in which he argues, in fact, that the case can be made that the Buddha was not an historical figure. That book will be translated, I think, and come out from Hawaii University Press fairly soon. So I think probably, James, you have to schedule a session with Bernard to talk about this question, whether the Buddha actually existed at all. But we're left again with this huge problem of dating the tradition that dates itself from the death of a figure whose death we cannot date. So that's the problem. That's number one.
Okay, so we have some questions here. Are you ready for some questions, Don?
Sure.
Okay, well, you sort of talked on it by talking about Bernard's book, but an anonymous attendee asks, how much evidence is there that the Buddha actually existed as an individual? Is there any evidence?
Well, again, the evidence that we have is from the time of Ashoka. And so we don't know, again, what this gap is, but we do have Ashoka mentioning the Buddha, saying that he himself has become a Buddhist upasaka, a Buddhist layperson. He tells monks and nuns not to start schisms in the Sangha. And he actually mentions some Buddhist texts. Now, the names of those Buddhist texts don't align with texts that we have now. And so we're not sure exactly what those are. There's no archaeological evidence of Buddhist monasteries existing during Ashoka's time. So probably the community was much more the wandering community that we know about from the tradition itself. But in terms of like finding the stupa of the Buddha and using some DNA test to date a tooth or a bone, that hasn't happened. And so all we have are really these rock edicts of Ashoka, again, from this later period. Okay, here's another question that probably is even more difficult to answer, but I'll ask it nonetheless. It's from Francois Thibault. We often assume that the Buddha lived for 80 years. However, I remember a university course that told the Pali Suttas may have created extra rain retreats by locating later suttas in Savatthi. So did the Buddha live 80 years or less? Well, again, very good question, because we have one text and one text only that says that the Buddha lived for 80 years. And of course, that's the very famous Mahaparinibbana Sutta, the account of his own passing. But that's where that number comes from. And then it's repeated in later works. But always as historians, I think we have to be suspicious of round numbers. And so this number of 80, again, we just don't know. But that's the number that's given. We have no other evidence for or against that.
Okay, so Matt Pearl asks, should we even be so hung up on this historical Buddha, assuming earlier sages had similar realizations?
Well, those earlier sages, of course, are the previous Buddhas. And according to Buddhist doctrine, of course, they have existed going back in the past, but their teaching completely disappears and it's completely forgotten. And so the role of the next Buddha is to find the Dharma again and teach that in the world. So the only person who has knowledge of the previous Buddhas is a Buddha himself. And we would not know of the previous Buddhas unless Shakyamuni Buddha had revealed their existence to us. If he didn't exist, then the whole kind of house of cards begins to fall apart.
Okay, well, here's another question from Salvatore Brienza. Hello, Sal. Is there evidence that Gautama was actually a prince or simply a member of the upper middle class, or is there no evidence either way?
So again, the archaeological evidence of the great city of Kapilavastu, where he was supposed to have grown up, it's quite a bit more modest than is presented in the sutras. Again, we're seeing always a competition in ancient India between the two castes, the two top castes, the Brahmanas or the priests, and the Kshatriyas or the warriors. And the Buddha, of course, is of the Kshatriya caste. Whether he was a prince or not, or whether there was such a king as Shuddhodana, his father, we don't have evidence of that.
Okay, someone says or asks, Marianne Marquez asks, would you please repeat what you said about Nagarjuna?
So we have a couple of texts in which there is a prophecy by the Buddha in which he says, 400 years after my passing, a sage will appear called Nagarjuna. And so again, we find these prophecies throughout Buddhist texts. And prophecies are generally a way for us to date events, so that we generally believe that prophecies are made in the time they're predicting something that's already happened. That is, probably there was already Nagarjuna. And of course, in order to give him the prominence that he deserves, a prophecy was invented. So prophecies tell us a lot about the moment in which the prophecy was made. They don't tell us much about the actual state of that. So there's an interesting theory that, of course, the most famous of the Buddhist prophecies is that when he ordained women, established the order of nuns, he said to Ananda, you sort of talked me into doing this. If I had not ordained women, my teaching would have lasted for 1,000 years. Because I'm ordaining women, it will last for 500 years. So the guess is that prophecy was made, that text was written about 500 years after the death of the Buddha, when some monks were unhappy about the existence of the order of nuns and were trying to then put those words in the Buddha's mouth. So speaking for the Buddha becomes a very important part of the tradition, which of course brings us to the Mahayana.
Okay, we'll get to that in 1 second. There's one more question here. Well, there are actually a few, but we'll need to move on. How are we able to assign any Buddhist text, e.g. the Dhammapada, to what the Buddha directly said? What makes one text more convincing than another as being said by the Buddha? So the question of whether we can identify any text as actually being spoken by the Buddha is something that scholars debate about. There are some scholars who feel that this can be done, others who feel that all we can do is sort of date the text in terms of their order of appearance. In the case of Pali, that can be done primarily through looking at grammar and various linguistic matters. When we get to the later tradition, we often date these texts by the date they were translated into Chinese, because the Chinese always provided the date in which the text was translated. So we know the text must have existed in India by that time. But otherwise, texts are not dated. And so apart from linguistic sort of matters, which give us an ability to kind of rank texts in terms of what came before the other, it's really difficult to take anything back to the Buddha himself with much certainty. Okay, Don, why don't you go on to the second question? So the second question is about the rise of the Mahayana. So we know that some years after the passing of the Buddha, whenever that was, we see the appearance of these texts called Mahayana Sutras.
We should not think of the Mahayana as a movement, but really as just texts that began to appear that had their own following. We really don't know exactly why this happened, but one of the things that we see is so essential to the rise of the Mahayana is writing. So in ancient India, the truth was considered to be speech, vach, voice, so that the Vedas, the sacred scriptures, even to say scripture is wrong because they weren't written down, the sacred words of ancient Hinduism, they were memorized and recited by Brahmin priests, a hereditary caste in which fathers taught sons, and they were just memorized literally forwards and backwards, preserved orally. We know also then that Buddhism was an oral tradition to begin. We know that texts are called the middle-sized text, the long text. We have evidence that there were monks whose specialty was to memorize the long ones, the middle-length ones. And so the memorization and recitation of sutras was a big part of the job of a Buddhist monk. And so that was preserved orally. We know that from the Vedic tradition, there were sophisticated mnemonics in order that allowed people to memorize these things. A lot of the repetition that we see in the Pali Sutras comes from this oral nature. And so they were preserved orally and then at some point written down. We have the first evidence that the first statement that the texts were written down actually is in Sri Lanka in the first decades before the Common Era. So again, centuries after the death of the Buddha, whenever that was. But then again, about this same time, perhaps late first century BCE or first century CE, we start seeing these new texts, which are composed works. They may have had begun orally, and they begin, "Thus did I hear." At one time, the Buddha was staying on Vulture Peak, and then the story, the sutra begins, as all sutras do. But these are the works of later monks and nuns. And in these texts, we have a lot of new ideas. So I think it's an overstatement to see a complete break between the earlier tradition and the Mahayana. But we certainly do see, for example, the Buddha being exalted in ways that he is not. We see this in the 18 schools, but he becomes an even more kind of deified figure in these texts. The Lotus Sutra says that his lifespan is immeasurable and that he didn't really pass into nirvana. The Bodhisattva goes from being this figure who is this rare person who takes this vow to liberate all beings in the future rather than become an arhat. This becomes the ideal. Philosophically, we see that impermanence is kind of displaced by emptiness. We see that this whole idea of detachment is no longer coming so much from disgust with the human body, but from the fact that everything is like an illusion. We see the Buddha nature, the whole idea of no self gets sort of transformed in ways in this whole Tathagata Garbha idea. And then we see the presence of different Buddhas, Amitabha being the most famous, these other Buddhas having their Buddha field, their pure lands. So all this is new. And this is the Mahayana that we now know is going to go to China, to Japan, to Korea, to Tibet, to Southeast Asia. But we have to recognize that the Mahayana was probably always a minority movement in India. One of the reasons that we know this is that we see all of the great Buddhist philosophers of the entire tradition in India, including the defense of the Mahayana in their works. So Nagarjuna does it, and it goes all the way through to Atisha. Really for 1,000 years, we have the Mahayana authors defending the sutras as the word of the Buddha, which means that many people said that they were not. We have the famous scene in the Lotus Sutra when 5,000 monks and nuns walk out when the Buddha is about to teach the Lotus Sutra. So we have all sorts of ways in which the Mahayana Sutras try to put down the Shravakas, the Arhats, the ways in which they try to present their own authenticity with all sorts of stories, like Nagarjuna went down under the ocean to find the Perfection Wisdom Sutras, which he received from the Nagas under the sea, these dragon-like figures. So what we have here really is the introduction of writing. Writing then provides portability. Writing provides a way to make many copies of something, obviously. Writing also allows forgery. And so writing then becomes a huge part then of the Mahayana tradition. And one of the things that we see that's so interesting in these texts, Lotus Sutra and many others, is that they all talk about the great karmic benefit that one receives from copying down this sutra. So copying the sutra, disseminating the sutra, preaching the sutra, all of these things bring benefits beyond that of building a stupa or all the other great gifts that one gives in Buddhism. So we see, again, for reasons that we don't know about, whenever this was, 400 years after the death of the Buddha, these texts beginning to be written in the voice of the Buddha long after the Buddha's death. And because they call themselves the Mahayana, the great vehicle, and because these texts became so important in China, in East Asia, in Tibet, and so forth, we tend to think that it won the day in India, but it did not. It was really this minority movement that was always trying to defend itself throughout its entire history. And in its favor, it was able to then be adopted in Tibet and elsewhere, and therefore has its great fame today.
Okay, we've got some questions here. Venerable Dhammadina asks, about early texts, aren't the Gandhara Suttas that Richard Solomon is working on, aren't they the earliest texts? Dr. Lopez is citing Sri Lanka as the earliest place.
So I didn't say that we have the text from Sri Lanka. I said that the first record we have of the Pali Tripitaka being written down is in a Sri Lankan story. But you're exactly correct. The earliest texts that we have today are the works that Rich Solomon and others have worked on from Pakistan. And so these are often texts that have very close correlates to the Pali canon. And those are the earliest surviving manuscripts. So you're right that those are the earliest texts that we have, but the first records of things being written down of the Pali canon itself. And of course, it's not the Pali text that Solomon has found. It's in a Sri Lankan history. It's interesting, however, that when we look at that writing, we see that writing is happening, at least talked about being written in Sri Lanka, right to the south of India, or in Gandhara, which is again to the north is really Pakistan and Afghanistan, really outside of the sort of Indian heartland. So one of the theories is that really texts were sort of maintained orally in the heartland, and it was really in the border countries, north and south, that writing began as a way of preserving these teachings.
Okay, an anonymous attendee asks, is there a major difference between traditions that arise based on texts versus oral traditions?
Well, of course, all we really have now are the texts, and so it's difficult for us to say, right? It's very difficult for us to sort of recover an oral world. And so the work that's been done on Homeric epics and so forth has been going back to other societies that have preserved things orally. And we see the kind of repetition, the tropes and so forth that we see in Homer, we also see in Indian texts. But all we have for us today are the texts. That's what's left. And so if it's not written down, we don't have it. And so it's very difficult to sort of make sort of claims about an oral tradition, at least in the case of Buddhism, apart from just seeing the evidence of early orality in the Pali Suttas themselves with their repetitions and sort of, yeah.
Okay, Aidan Hepworth asks, if all sutras were memorized rather than written down, how do we know that the Mahayana texts were so much later? And does the lack of Mahayana records necessarily mean that the Mahayana is in any sense less authentic?
Well, so when we look at the Mahayana Sutras, there are a number of texts. Take the Lotus Sutra, for example, which has quite a large part of it's in verse. And so the idea is that it began in verse, and then the prose part was added later. But again, what we see in the Mahayana Sutras is a kind of a condemnation of the tradition as it's developed. We have Shariputra, Moggallana, Mahakashyapa, all of the great arhats who are the heroes of the early tradition being belittled here and there. And so it's difficult to imagine that the Buddha would be in some circumstances praising Shariputra as the greatest of all the arhats, the wisest of arhats, and then mocking him in another sutra. And so there's all sorts of reasons to really think of this as these sutras that's coming from another later Buddhist community, which for whatever reason, and there may have been very good reasons, were concerned about the way the tradition was going. That feeling that it sort of lost its spirit, there was something that was gone there. And so they added to the tradition, in the tradition's vocabulary, in these fabulous texts that we study today. And so whether they were taught by the Buddha or not, I think ultimately is not that important. But of course, we know that when one takes the Bodhisattva vows, one of the infractions of the vows is to claim that the Mahayana Sutras are not the word of the Buddha. And so infractions are not made for things that people don't do. And so the fact that this is an infraction means that there were many people saying that the Mahayana Sutras were not the word of the Buddha from early on.
Okay, Don, you've written plenty on the Heart Sutra, and so I'll ask what Eric Shabenyi asks. What is your opinion of the Chinese origin of Jan Natier's The Heart Sutra thesis?
That's required quite a long answer, but my own view is that it's an Indian text of Indian origin. We have many Indian commentaries, and I think it's unlikely that we would have Xuanzang write a text that would make its way back to India, be back translated into Sanskrit, have a preface and a conclusion added to that, and then the great figures from Kamalashila to Atish and so forth and write commentaries on it. So there's a lot to say about that, but I'm in the Indian camp on that one.
Okay. Matthew Nyman asks, is it also true that Mahayana attended to the laity rather than monks?
So that was an early theory, right? So I think especially coming out of Japanese Buddhism, there was the idea, especially coming from those of the Jodo Shinshu school, right, of the devotees of Amitabha in Japan, that this is just really a lay movement. But that theory is no longer taken that seriously because the authors of the Mahayana Sutras have such a precise knowledge of Buddhist doctrine. They have such a precise knowledge of the Buddhist canon. And the general sense is, apart from these unusual figures like Vimalakirti, who's so unusual because he's a layman, the idea was it would have been trained, educated monks and nuns who knew the vocabulary, knew the tropes, knew the stories quite well, who could then produce these sort of literary masterpieces.
Okay, so here is a question from Dennis Skipper. What is the relationship between the Mahasangaka and the Mahayana?
So again, we have records we talk about the 18 schools. And so when after the death of the Buddha, we see a traditional number of 18 schools developing. Typically, these schools have minor differences in doctrine, but some differences in Vinaya, in the monastic code. In fact, that number 18 is just a number that's often restated. When we look at the numbers that actually appear in the text, there are many more than that. So there's some idea that the Mahasangaka, which supposedly broke off from the Stavira school, was the forerunner of the Mahayana, but we see sort of proto-Mahayana elements in many of the early schools. And so it's generally not said that the Mahasangaka uniquely was the forerunner of the Mahayana.
Okay, this question is from Roshni P. Is Mahayana Buddhism the same as Tibetan Buddhism?
Well, so we would say that Tibetan Buddhism is one of the national traditions of Buddhism that accepts the Mahayana Sutras as the word of the Buddha. That would be the easiest way to say that. So the Tibetans, of course, believe that the Buddha taught the Mahayana Sutras. The Dalai Lama, of course, believes that. And so that makes one a Mahayanist. It's basically someone who, there's a famous statement by the Chinese pilgrim Yu Jing, who said that a Mahayanist is someone who worships bodhisattvas and accepts the Mahayana Sutras as the word of the Buddha. That's the definition going way back in time. And he found that both Mahayana and non-Mahayana monks were living together in the same monasteries. So it wasn't as if they were huge antagonists, but it is the case that there were some who accepted these texts as the word of the Buddha and some who did not.
One last question, again from Dennis Skipper. Some scholars have suggested Amitabha and the Pure Land movement arose in later Buddhism as an attempt to attract and keep followers within Buddhism by adding a godlike figure in a paradise realm. Do you have an opinion on this?
Again, so there's a lot of theories, early theories about Amitabha, whether this came from Persia, the sort of imagery of light and so forth. But again, we start seeing Buddha fields for many other Buddhas. Amitabha becomes important for a number of reasons. And in some ways, because he became so important in China and Japan. But there are other Buddha fields. And of course, the Buddha mentioned his own Buddha field in the Vimalakirti Sutra. And so the idea, once we have the idea of multiple Buddhas and multiple Buddha fields, which we see even in the Lotus Sutra, that's already there. And so I think it's really a question of just a multiplication of Buddha verses rather than any kind of heaven. Although one has to say that the Sukhavati, the Pure Land of Amitabha, sounds a lot like heaven.
Okay, Don, we're ready for the third question.
Okay, so the third one is, what are the origins of Buddhist Tantra? And again, this is probably, it's hard for me to rank these as which are most difficult to answer, but this one is right there. And the problem is, one of the problems is, what do we mean by Tantra? So we have this term Tantra in Sanskrit, which means like a handbook or a manual, sort of a how-to thing. And we find that term Tantra as on names of many texts in Sanskrit, not all of which are tantras in the sense of what we would think of as a Buddhist Tantra. So what we see here is, for example, the rise of wrathful deities. We see the rise of sexual imagery. We see the rise of mantras. We see the rise of mandalas, what we might even want to call magic. But one thing to consider that's important is that all of these things were already there in one form or another. So we could take the example of Vajrapani, the bodhisattva of power. So we think of Vajrapani in Tibetan Buddhism as the Riksum Grumbo, the protectors of the three lineages. He's the bodhisattva of power, and along with Manjushri for wisdom and Avalokiteshvara for compassion. Hugely important figure in the Mahayana. But we tend to forget that Vajrapani is also found in the Pali Canon. So sometimes you can see these early stone carvings of the Buddha, and somewhere in the background, there's somebody, often a bearded figure, holding a club. This is Vajrapani. So Vajrapani in the early tradition is a yaksha, which is just kind of a local kind of a spirit. He carries a vajra. We don't know what this word means. We use it all the time, but it's in the Vedic tradition, it seems to be some kind of a weapon that Indra had, maybe a discus or a thunderbolt. Clearly, it's a club in these early Buddhist statues. And we have cases in the Pali Canon of Vajrapani accompanying the Buddha, people refusing to answer a question by the Buddha. And Vajrapani will appear, and the Buddha says, if you don't answer the next time I ask you this, Vajrapani will smash your head to pieces. And so we have Vajrapani as the protector of the Buddha from very early on. However, we see him evolve. Once we get into the Tantras, then he's not simply this kind of henchman, this bodyguard. He becomes this very important bodhisattva, in some texts even called a Buddha. And so one of the things that we see in the rise of Buddhist Tantra are these kind of peripheral figures, these figures in a statue who are just in the corner, these figures in a mandala that are at the outside. We have this term in Sanskrit, the dwarapala, door guard, right? The guy who guards the gate, the doorman. And these dwarapalas, these door protectors become dharmapalas, these dharma protectors. And they start moving from the periphery of the statue to the center. They start moving from the edge of the mandala to the center. And so for reasons that we don't understand, we find magic, war magic, violence, sex, these things all beginning to make their way into Indian tantric texts, both Hindu and Buddhist. Again, what Tantra means, it remains a question. And these things which are largely about magic early on, defeating enemies, long life, finding buried treasure, all these kinds of things that we associate with magic, these texts become theologized later on. So they become the foundation for the great traditions, especially in Tibetan Buddhism of the highest Yoga Tantra. We have the Yoga Tantra tradition in Shingon in Japan. But exactly the dividing line between Mahayana and Tantra is very hard to draw. Whether Tantra is something of quote unquote Hindu origin or Buddhist origin is something people debate about. We know that the Buddhists were at odds with the followers of Shiva, the Shaivites in India. And so Shiva is often being destroyed in these various tantras. We have Hindu deities being beaten, trampled upon by these guardian deities, by these wrathful deities. The difference is that these wrathful deities, instead of being these sort of scary figures, which they probably were at the beginning, have now been brought into the pantheon, and they are now worshipped, and they're on our side. And so therefore, these figures with these garlands of human heads and carrying all these weapons with all these arms and heads and legs, they're good. They're dharma protectors, they're bodhisattvas, they're Buddhas, and they are the ones who are going to bring us to enlightenment more quickly. But that goal of enlightenment, this called the supramundane attainment, that seems to be added later. The earlier attainments are all about finding buried treasure, being able to fly, all these kind of magic things. And it's clearly that magic that attracts the early tantric sort of patrons, the kings, whether it's in India or in Tibet, to these particular teachers. When we look at the spread of Buddhism, it's typically when each country tells the story of the arrival of Buddhism, it's usually not about some monk preaching the Dharma in some village. It's about a monk coming to court and having something that the king wants. Often it's medicine, and very often it's magic. And so Buddhism spreads from court primarily up through the very magical powers and other medicinal cures from India, for example, that these monks might bring. And this is what gets Buddhism started there. And so we tend to not to want to talk about magic in the case of Buddhism, but it's hugely important and certainly becomes very central in the Tantric case.
Okay. Is there any connection between Tibetan Buddhism and Japanese Shingon? Are they both tantric?
Yes. So basically, you probably know that we divide the tantras. We have this division in India into the four tantras: the action tantras, performance yoga, and highest yoga. And so David Snellgrove and other scholars have really argued that everything below highest yoga, performance, and action probably represents a kind of a ritualization of the Mahayana Sutras. So it was really the yoga tantras that became established in China. And it was in China that Kukai, the great Shingon founder, went and received these teachings, brought these mandalas and these mantras back to Japan. And so the tradition that we see in Shingon is Yoga Tantra. The Tibetans are very proud of the fact that they are the maintainers of the tradition of highest Yoga Tantra. And of course, according to their system, it's only by the practice of highest Yoga Tantra that one can achieve Buddhahood. And in fact, that all Buddhists of the past have practiced the highest Yoga Tantra. And so they would want to say that Buddhahood is not possible through the Yoga Tantra teaching, which of course is something that the Shingon practitioners would disagree with.
Okay. The next question, did Tantra in Hinduism predate Tantra in Buddhism, or did they arise together, or do we not know?
We really don't know. I mean, there just seems to be this tantric thing. And again, what tantra even means, I think, is something we have to continue to ask ourselves. But we see a lot of interchange between the texts, and we sometimes see passages from a Hindu text being repeated in a Buddhist text, with sometimes the name of a Buddha being substituted for Shiva, and vice versa. So there just seem to have been these tantrikas who probably in the beginning were not monastic, who were just these kind of wandering yogins who had their own practices, their own deities that they worshiped. The mandala, of course, this word mandala, which we imagine as this very elaborate sort of thing, what we see in Tibetan tantras, just means circle in Sanskrit. And so it could have been something as simple as a circle drawn on the ground in which you're given some initiation, and then you're allowed to step inside. You're an initiate of this particular deity. You're taught the mantras in order to attract this deity. And so, but again, mantras are not unique to Tantra, right? We know, we look at the Mahayana Sutras, it's very common for these sutras to have a final chapter of dharani, which are basically just long mantras. And so this idea of repeating mantras goes back to the Mahayana at least. And so again, when the dividing line is, when it begins, and where the Hindu-Buddhist divide is, apart from the names of the main deity in the text, is very hard to determine.
Okay, Aidan Hepworth asks, is there perhaps a case that Tantra is a form of syncretism or even a reaction to it? Do you have any insight into the interaction between Bon and Tantric Buddhism in Tibet as a case study?
So you're talking about the Tibetan case, right? Where Pern and yeah.
Yes.
So early scholars tended to regard Pern as the pre-Buddhist religion of Tibet. We generally dispute that today, or are really looking into that, because when you look at Pern, seems to really begin as a textual tradition about the same time as Nyingma comes to the fore. It's really after the second dissemination of Buddhism that we start. We certainly have the term Pern and Pernbo as a priest during the early period, but as a religion, as a tradition, we don't know much about what the tradition was. And when we look at Pern texts today, they're very, very similar to Buddhist texts in terms of their vocabulary. They put Pern instead of Chur, or they substitute Pern for dharma. But the monastic order, all of the pantheon, it's so similar that we see a lot of influence between the two. And so it's probably difficult to say that we don't really know what existed in Tibet prior to the introduction of Buddhism when Padmasambhava and Shantarakshita came. Of course, there's questions whether Padmasambhava was a historical figure. And so this whole demon taming story that we see that's so important in Tibetan history, all of that may also be a myth. And so we're always left with these questions of what really happened historically.
Okay. Is it fair to say that the Buddha had teachers who were familiar with the yogic Vedic teachings? Was Buddha a yogi?
Yes. So when we look at the Buddha talks about two teachers, and both of them are teachers of meditation. They are clearly yogins. They seem to be sadhus with the long dreadlocks. And they are achieving very high states of concentration, meditation, in what the Buddhists call the formless realm. The Buddha very quickly equals them in their attainment and figures that their attainment is not the goal that he's seeking, so he leaves them. So we really only have the names of these two. We don't know much about who they were, but we do know that, again, we don't know when the Buddha lived or whether there even was a Buddha, but we're assuming that he lived during this period of around the time of the Upanishads and later, that he was, that there were many, many different teachers, many different traditions, many philosophies. We have the names of many of those in Buddhist texts. And interestingly, only two survive to the present day. One is Buddhism, one is Jainism. So those two survived. Yoga, of course, is just going to be a term for religious practice at this time. The whole kind of hatha yoga thing, that the yoga postures that one does in the yoga studio, those all seem to be a much later development. But certainly the term yoga appears obviously in Buddhist texts many times, and the Buddha from that perspective was certainly a yogin, yeah.
Okay, what about the characterization of Bon as a shamanic path?
Well, again, what we mean by shamanism is, a big question. And it's, again, because we have so little from Pern that predates the introduction of Buddhism, it's just very hard to sort of, to kind of see that historically. So shamanism, of course, we see in Central Asia in many places. There must have been some kind of shamanism in Tibet, and even the early stories about the kings ascending to heaven on a rope, whether this is some kind of a shamanic thing or not. It depends on how we define shamanism, which is a big question for scholars. But again, exactly how Pern and Buddhism, how they related and what Pern even was before Buddhism came in, I think is a question that we really can't answer right now.
Okay, there's so many good questions, but we're going to have to move on to the fourth. So if you asked a question that didn't get answered, I'll try to call on those who have not yet asked questions. Go ahead.
Okay, so the last question is, why did Buddhism disappear from India? And of course, there are two key words in that question. The first is, what do you mean by Buddhism, and what do you mean by disappear? So I wrote something about the European encounter with Buddhism. And I think in one of my books, I said that when Vasco da Gama's ship landed on the southern coast of India in 1497, Buddhism had disappeared from the subcontinent. And so, well, what does that really mean? So we can say that, of course, there is a narrative of the disappearance of Buddhism. Something that we find, of course, in Tibetan Buddhism very strongly. But And there is a very strong narrative, which we must dispute, which is that the destruction of Buddhism or the loss of Buddhism in India was due to Muslim invasions. So there's a lot to sort of process here. But when we look at the earliest scholars of Buddhism in Europe, they believed that Buddhism had disappeared from India. And they believed that Buddhism had been driven out of India by the evil Brahmins, by the Brahmin priests, by the Hindus. But once we get the records and the travel accounts of the great Chinese pilgrims, most importantly of Xuanzang, the great Tang Dynasty monk who was in India from 627 to 645, he's traveling all over the place, and he is describing again and again and again deserted monasteries. Some monasteries are thriving, some are just completely, there's nobody there, they're in ruins. And so we know that once Buddhism became sedentary, right, that once it was not just these wandering monks who were being fed in villages as they wandered from door to door begging for their alms each morning, once you start getting large monasteries, it's impossible for those monasteries to be supported by the local population. They must have royal patronage. And so we have examples of kings giving land to monasteries. Workers are given to plow those fields and grow these crops, and those crops are then given to the monks and nuns for their food. But if the king is not there, if the king is overthrown, if his dynasty dies out, if that king is replaced by a Hindu king, then that monastery will die because it has no source of sustenance. You have to remember that this word that we translate as monk and nun, right? Bhikshu and bhikshuni in Sanskrit literally means beggar, right? Monks and nuns are prohibited by the Vinaya from touching money. They are prohibited from tilling the soil. They're prohibited from earning a living. And therefore, they are completely reliant on the community. And if the trade route shifts north or south, and there's no more merchants who are big supporters of Buddhism coming through town, that monastery is going to become deserted. And so we have to say then that long before any Muslims arrived in India, Buddhism was declining in many regions, thriving in some, declining in others. So what can we say about the Muslims? So we have the Kalachakra Tantra, one of the most famous of all tantric texts. For important reasons, or we're able to date that text to have been composed about 1025 of the Common Era. And we're probably also able to place it in Pakistan. And as many of you know, the Kalachakra Tantra describes an apocalyptic war which will come in the distant future between the army of Shambhala, the Buddhist army, which is off somewhere in the Himalayas, who will come back and will recapture India and will defeat the Mlechas. Mlecha is a Sanskrit word usually translated as barbarian. But when we read the Kalachakra Tantra, it's very clear that these are Muslims. Their teacher in Sanskrit is Madhumati, Muhammad. They pray toward a city called Mecca. They cut off the ends of their penises, that is, they practice circumcision. So there's no question that by the time the Kalachakra was composed in the early 11th century, Buddhists felt threatened in the north by Muslims. We then know that the Nalanda monastery was sacked. We have, for example, the Tibetan pilgrim Chalotsawa, who goes to Bodh Gaya in 1234. He comes to the Holy of Holies, the most sacred place in the Buddhist world, the site of the Buddha's enlightenment, and it is being tended by 4 monks. And those monks are probably from Sri Lanka. And these monks tell him that the Muslims, they call them the Turks, the Muslim patrols are going to be coming through soon. We have to now hide in the jungle. So what they do is they brick up the entrance to the temple that houses the famous Buddha image. They put a picture of Shiva in front of the door, so they might think it's a Hindu temple, and they go off and run in the woods. And in fact, these armies pass by, and they have to come out and after that. So by the time Chalotsawa, 1234, the Muslims are riding by Bodh Gaya. Shakya Shribhadra, the great teacher who came to Tibet in 1204, had been the abbot of Nalanda, and he and his monks came to Tibet because they were escaping what they saw as the persecution or the decline of Buddhism there. We know that Atisha, right, the great master who went to Tibet in 1042, talks about having gone to study in Suvarnadvipa, which is probably, maybe it's Sumatra, we don't know. He went on his long voyage in order to study bodhicitta with his teacher. So why was, if Atisha is the greatest scholar in all of India, why does he have to go on a ship on this long voyage to study with somebody, right, in Sumatra? So Buddhism must have been in decline by this time for all sorts of reasons, but whether exactly when it began and when it actually ended is hard to say, because we have to say, well, what does it mean for Buddhism to be gone? If there are no longer any big monasteries, is it gone? Well, one could say yes. If there are lay people who are still worshiping images of the Buddha, say in Chittagong in the border with Myanmar to the far east, is Buddhism still there? One would say perhaps yes. Tarnata, right, the great late 16th century, early 17th century Tibetan master. His teacher was a Siddha called Buddhismtantra, and he came to Tibet in 1588. And Tarnata considered him to be a Buddhist, although Buddhismtantra said that he'd only encountered Buddhism late in life, and he'd found it by going to some island, and it's an island that we can't identify. So exactly what it means for Buddhism to disappear and what we mean by Buddhism, these are big questions, but certainly as an institutional presence, it seems to have been gone by the time that the Europeans arrived in 1497. And it was probably largely because of simply the loss of patronage. Royal patronage.
Okay, so one question is, what is the evidence that the decline of Buddhism was partly caused by the return of caste system structures in India?
Well, I think it's often said that the Buddha was an opponent of caste. He really wasn't. So anyone who became a yogin, who became an ascetic, a shramana, they typically left the caste system. They were no longer bound by caste rules. So we can say that one thing that the Buddha did do was that he did admit members of the two lower castes and even the lowest caste into the order. Of course, the great Upali, the master of the Vinaya, was from the lowest caste. He was a barber. But when we look at the names of, when we see a name of a Buddhist monk or nun in the Pali Canon and their caste is mentioned, they're overwhelmingly Brahmins and Kshatriyas from the top two castes. But the Buddha himself says that the Buddha will always be either a Brahmin or a Kshatriya based on whatever the higher caste is at the time of his birth. And so the caste system was there, and there's really not much evidence that caste itself had much to do with the decline of Buddhism.
Okay, is current hostility toward Muslims in India due to resentment? Oops, I lost it. Oh, due to resentment of the historical Muslim invasions and quote unquote demolition of Buddhism?
Well, there aren't that many Buddhists in India right now anyway, right? I mean, apart from the Tibetans. And certainly when we read the Tibetan authors, they do sort of follow the Kalachakra Tantra as one of their main texts. And so they do have this view of Islam. It's still obviously quite outdated. The antagonism toward Muslims in India is, of course, much more from the Hindu community, which is by far the majority, and they have their own history, obviously, with Islam.
Okay, Anna Laura Brousseau asks, is there any historical commentary within monastic Buddhism of its lay communities?
Of its lay communities?
Yeah, is there any historical commentary within monastic Buddhism of its lay communities?
Well, I mean, so the stories, of course, are mostly about monks, but their dealings are with the laity. And so we have the names of a number of lay followers of the Buddha, some of whom are very important. Lay people play roles in various Buddhist sutras all the time. It's generally the case that they are not big meditators. It's generally rare for a lay person to become an arhat in the early tradition, but we have the names of many lay people, and they play important roles in the text. Yeah.
Okay, It's hard to find these questions because everybody's singing your praises, Don. They're saying thank you and they're marveling at your historical knowledge, but I won't read those to you. But I will ask another question. When do the scriptures predict the coming of future Buddha or Maitreya?
I think it's in about 6 billion years. I have to check that, but it's way off. So, you know, it's waiting for Maitreya is going to be a long wait. Yeah.
Okay, can you repeat the date and source of first written example of a polycanon text?
You know, I'm trying to remember. You mean the first mention of the text being written down? I think it's somewhere. I think it's about 25 BCE, but I'm guessing. Yeah.
Okay, I'll ask you this because you've written so much about him. Didn't Gendon Chopo mention some tantric practitioners who claimed they were following the Buddhist path?
So Gendon Chopo came across a group of men and women in the woods in eastern India, and they were having sex, and he believed that they were tantric practitioners. He didn't talk to them, at least by his own account. He just witnessed this. It's a strange story. He's this kind of this voyeur watching this orgy going on in the jungle and seeing that as evidence of tantric practice. So that's what he says. And he did believe that there may have been some remnants left over and people mistaking Buddhist statues for Hindu deities and vice versa. And he wanted it to be there. So he certainly did want there to be some hidden tantric practice left, especially going toward into Chittagong and into Myanmar. Yeah.
Another question, where does Shantideva fit into what you've been talking about?
He's right there. So Shantideva, of course, is going to be one of the authors who is defending the Mahayana as the word of the Buddha. So he's right there in the list of the great commentators who make that a standard part of their works. He's going to, of course, be the author of one of the most famous Buddhist texts, Bodhicharyavatara, but also very important to us because he has made this great compendium of sutras, the Shiksha Samuccaya, right, the compendium of training. And so it gives us an idea of what sutras are being read during his time and what sutras were known because he quotes from many of them. So that's one way for us to date texts and know which texts were important during his lifetime. Yeah.
Okay, Palmiers asks, who was the witness to Tantra practice again?
Gendon Chopo.
Okay.
The book is called Grains of Gold, translated by Thupten Jimba and me.
Right. Almost everything you're asking, there's a book about that Don has written. So I'll continue. One more question. What about the great Shivite teacher, Shankaracharya? Does he figure into the decline of Buddhism in India?
Yes, so he's the great Advaita Vedanta teacher, huge opponent of Buddhism, wrote against Buddhism very strongly, and many people feel that he was responsible for the decline of Buddhism in at least his region of India. But there were many Hindu teachers, great philosophers, condemning Buddhism for centuries, and Buddhist writers like Shantarakshita, Bhavaveka were defending themselves all the time against the Hindu philosophers.
Okay, Don, somebody's asking you to sum up Buddhism in a nutshell. I don't know if we have the time because you have seconds perhaps. What is Buddhism fundamentally about? But I won't make you answer that. Unless you want to give it a shot.
Well, so I just finished my introduction to Buddhism class at the University of Michigan last month. And the students are always asking me exactly that question or what I think. And so what I often say is that I think there are two things in Buddhism that are factually accurate, at least two. And one is that death is definite and the time of death is indefinite. That is, death is certain, the time of death is uncertain. And secondly, that everybody wants happiness and doesn't want suffering. So there are those two things. I ask my students to think about those two and what follows from those two statements.
Great. Okay, I'm going to second so many of our listeners and viewers who are thanking you, Don, and I send my heartfelt thanks to you for everything over the years. So thank you for being with us today, and thank you to all of you who have joined us. We are providing these sessions for free, so if you want to help support this and our other efforts, please consider donating to Tricycle at tricycle.org/donate. If you don't already subscribe to Tricycle, consider becoming a subscriber today. To hear more from Don and other leading Buddhist writers, teachers, and scholars, visit tricycle.org/subscribe. So thanks so much, Don. You know, you've been a real godsend to us, your contributions, your books, everything over decades. So thank you.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, James.
I hope we can do this again.
Anytime.
And thank you to the listeners for all your wonderful questions.